Come join Melissa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin. You know, the show where I virtually invite people into the blog cabin to chat about life. And today we're going to chat about this amazing book that I wish was written when my girls were little, because my girls are age 30 to 22 right now, because this would have helped me so much. It's called Your Child's Greatness, A Parent's Guide to Raising Children Without Imposter Syndrome, because I think imposter syndrome is huge, and especially huge for women.
Yeah.
Dr. Lisa, welcome to the show. Before we start talking about your book, tell us a little about yourself.
So I am a psychologist and executive coach based in New York City, and I've been in practice for about 20 years and mostly focused on mid-level career people, executives, and their leadership styles, their kind of advancement, as well as dealing with imposter syndrome. I've been talking about that for a very long time. This is my third book on it. So,
wow, third book.
Yes.
You would think you would have already figured it out by the first one, but things come up all the time, and imposter
very different contexts.
Yeah, imposter syndrome is so big. Even adult people suffer with imposter syndromes. I mean, that's so big. So tell us.
I think that's why we started. Yeah. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm interrupting you. This conversation is going to be so much fun.
So that's how we wrote the third book, is because the first book was about how to have adults overcome it. So mostly we focused on adults when we think about imposter syndrome. And then the second book was about leadership and culture and how work culture and leadership affect imposter syndrome. And this book was about preventing imposter syndrome. And what I was sort of struggling with is, like, you know, as a researcher, as a social scientist, one of the things I really have been sad about is that there are no cohort effects, meaning that there's no generational effects. It's not getting any better. It's not getting any worse. It's not getting any better. And the book was an attempt to kind of empower parents to have the tools to actually make this generation coming up the first one that has a cohort effect, where they have it less than the people who've preceded them.
So what made you decide to focus on imposter syndrome, though?
Yeah, because I had it myself. Probably not surprised, but I had spent my whole educational career, my whole early work career, really struggling with it and feeling like I was hiding most of it, feeling like I was one moment or mistake away from, like, losing everything, like being found out that I wasn't as smart as everyone thought I was or capable as everyone thought I was. And so a lot of my world was shaped around, like, overworking to prove myself, which was just constantly how I operated. I went from chronic burnout phase to chronic burnout phase. I just was always just exhausted and just feeling like I could never stop running. And I think it wasn't until I talk about this in my TEDx talk, but it wasn't until I was in a really terrible work situation with a boss that I think didn't maybe know concretely that I had imposter syndrome, but knew there were parts of me he could manipulate, that I was like, I need to get over this. I need to deal with this, because he's using it in service of himself and I'm stuck. And that's when I started to work on it myself, started writing about it. And then an editor approached me to write our first book on it. So that's how it all came to be.
For those that don't know, what is imposter syndrome?
So imposter syndrome is the experience when you are competent, capable, educated, experienced, but you haven't internalized that. And as a result of not internalizing that, you tend to feel like a fraud. And so to cover up that concern about being a fraud, you then either overwork or self-sabotage to manage that, and then have trouble taking in feedback. So positive feedback is ignored, negative feedback is hyper-focused on, and then we never bother internalizing our strengths, capabilities, and skills. So we constantly get caught in a cycle that leads to feeling like we're never good enough.
So majority of the people that suffer from it, women suffer more than men, or am I mistaken?
Actually, what's funny is for that kind of idea about women experiencing came from the initial research. The initial research starts in like 1978, when two psychologists write a paper about imposter syndrome from their experiences of working in a college counseling center in Georgia. And then what happens is for the next 10 years or so, people just research women, and then we find out over the next 20 or 30 years that men experience it about the same as women. And then in July of 2024, a kind of pretty definitive paper came out, a meta-analytic study that found that women do experience it slightly significantly more than men, but still more. So yes,
Why
women
do
do
you think
experience it more.
why do you think that is? Do you think women are more vocal because they think they're experiencing it, or do you think men just want to bury things because you know
Yeah.
how that goes?
Yeah. Well, what the research finds is, and I think this is why we experience it more often and more frequently, but I think what the research finds is that women tend to be counterphobic. So they will actually face the thing that they fear. And so as a result, they're triggered for their imposter syndrome more often. Where men aim toward mastery, they want to get something mastered and right. And so they never take risks. They never put themselves in positions where they will feel not good enough. But that also makes them underperform and go for things that are safe. So we find that men with imposter syndrome tend to be underperforming. And so it is probably because men are avoiding the trigger where women are not avoiding the trigger, which actually is good for women in some way.
So let's move on to, you want to create an impact to this generation, the children, to make sure that they don't suffer from it as an adult.
Yeah.
What can
Yep.
parents do?
So I think for parents, it's really, our book is really about sort of rethinking sort of parenting and really helping parents to really consider the way that they are parenting and how that might impact our children. So, for example, thinking about authority dynamics. And so for parents, oftentimes we are the authority figure in the house, but it's also really important for us to make sure that our children also have voice, because one of the things that we know about people who develop imposter syndrome is that they often grow up in a couple different family environments. One of them is an authoritarian family environment, one where parents are ultimately in charge. You have no voice, you're not seen. If you are accomplishing something, it's about your parents' ability to parent you and not your natural skills. And so, the opposite is also true. So kids who have been abandoned and neglected, they also develop it because nobody is also giving them feedback around, like, how valuable they are, how skilled they are. No, that's not happening. So they have to use their achievements to get out of their circumstances. So we, thinking about sort of like how we parent, how we engage our kids, how we talk about their strengths, how we deal with their failures, all becomes really important to helping them feel a sense of confidence from their skills and the ability to take feedback naturally, but also be able to take compliments in a positive direction that they internalize those strengths.
Yeah, because one of the things that you mentioned, you talk about the parent being the authoritarian in the relationship. When you are a child of a narcissistic parent, you don't get that feedback. And I know you
Yeah.
mentioned that in the book as well.
That narcissistic parents can be a significant effect because in essence it's all about them, and so the child becomes in service of them. And so that's the way people operate oftentimes with imposter syndrome, is you're in service of your boss, you're in service of your mentor, you're in service of your professor. You never sort of think about sort of, what do I want, what do I need, like, how is this going to help me? Because you never got to think those thoughts. You just got to think, am I being pleasing enough? Am I showing up the way they want me to? And so that became the way we orient ourselves toward any kind of authority figure or leadership person in our life that deals with leadership. So these dynamics are very powerful in a child's experience, and they do sort of set the kind of foundation for how that we deal with people in authority.
And in your studies have you seen a change when parents have implemented certain things, like you mentioned in the book with children, how children have developed more?
Yeah, I mean, what a lot of the research does find is that authoritative parents, so parents that in the end make the final decision, but let their child voice their
Mhm.
interests, their concerns, whatever it might be, as a part of the decision making, lead to kids who have more autonomy, more sense of self, have a better ability to kind of make things happen for themselves without leaning on someone else. This authoritative parenting style really helps them to feel a sense of, I'm being heard. It may not be my end all choice at the end, but I get to be heard. And it's also the converse of like permissive parenting. So my criticism of a lot of gentle parenting going on
Mhm.
currently is that, it very quickly can veer into permissive parenting, where in essence, the power dynamics are upside down, where the child is controlling the house and the parents have lost control. And that's not helpful for a kid either, because kids who grow up in those environments, while they look really powerful, are really scared because they know they're not qualified to be running a household or making decisions that they're getting to make. And so it is really important to find the balance in between them and to make sure that you remember you have the ultimate power in the helm, but you also want to hear from your little people about sort of what they may want. Doesn't mean that's what you're going to decide, but it's important to hear them out.
That is so true, because I feel like when children are given choices, like if parents hear out what, like, say for instance, they want to go on vacation and they want some input, and I've seen kids go completely off the wall and off the rails and do PowerPoints and everything else to
Yes.
but the fact that they know they have a little bit of say in where they're going, or they may not be able to go where they want to go, but still they were able to say, hey, this is where I think we should go, and be able to prepare themselves for that. I think
And advocate for themselves by doing the PowerPoint or whatever it is, to be able to say, here's why I want to go X. And that it's not just like a random thought, but even that's how we adults make decisions. It's like, I might want to go to like Bora Bora, but I don't have the Bora Bora money. So, like, I have to go to Florida. So allowing them to also make decisions with like data and information can be really helpful, so that they understand how decision making is made. Yes, absolutely. And I think, I think it's really, I've heard this said, and I think it's so important, which is like, don't give a child a choice if they don't have a choice. Like if you've decided and it's there, they don't have a choice, then just tell them we're going here. But if they do have a say, you can then ask them. So ask them when it is actually their input will make a difference. So I do think it's really important too, is like not to fake them into believing they have an input when they really don't, because eventually they understand that that's not the case. And so really letting them have authority where they can.
I think even if you start small, like, hey, what kind of sides do you want? Here's your choices, this, and
Yeah.
this for dinner. Let them pick out what they want.
Yeah, giving them decision-making opportunities under like a parental support is really helpful, because oftentimes with imposter syndrome, decision-making power is really based on what other people want from you.
Mhm.
You don't make decisions based on what you want for yourself. You don't know how to do that. That feels really foreign. And so teaching a kid from very early on that they have some autonomy, that they can make some decisions, not all decisions, but they can participate in the making of some decisions, and also take responsibilities when those decisions may not go so well. Like they have to also do that too, as a part of the power of the authority in and of itself.
That is so true. We need to take a brief commercial break, but we will be right back.
People welcomed me, and they knew the pain of the journey that we'd been on because they'd been there too.
Other Parents Like Me is an online community, peer-led, for parents with kids struggling with mental health and or substances.
It's a space that's safe. Feels like I can actually share what's going on.
We offer 15 daily support groups per week and live speaker talks on Thursdays, as well as a monthly expert panel.
We also have a resource hub that has a toolkit. This includes over 1,000 articles, podcasts. There's a glossary with the most recent and relevant terms. And we have a directory that's been vetted.
The overwhelming feeling when we're sitting in a meeting and I'm telling my story and I see others shaking their head, tears falling, they understand this roller coaster and they're along for the ride.
And we are back talking with Dr. Lisa, who is the author, one of the co-authors of Your Child's Greatness, A Parent's Guide to Raising Children Without Imposter Syndrome. Now, one of the quotes that I really picked out in this book, it says, parenting is not about having all the answers, but continuously adapting, supporting, and encouraging our children as they navigate the world. And that's so true.
Yeah.
A lot of parents think they're supposed to have all the answers.
Yeah. And fault themselves when they don't. And I think it's really important to not get in this blame cycle for yourself. And I don't want people to read the book and ever feel like terrible about, like, I don't want that at all, because I'm also a parent and I make mistakes all the time. And I really, part of like being able to tolerate parenting for me was knowing I'm going to make a ton of mistakes and all I can do is learn from them. Like, I'm not trying to be a perfect parent. I'm just trying to be a human parent and develop along the way. And so when we know better, generally we do better, but until we know better, we don't. And so like, it's okay. Like, you have to forgive yourself and then move forward. But, I think it's important to not expect to know all the answers. we should never know them until, not even when we're like old and about to be in the grave, like we shouldn't know all the answers.
Yeah, for sure. And parenting, like you said, parenting is an ongoing journey, and it changes for each stage that your child's in. Like I said, mine are young adults right now. They're ages 22 through 30, almost 30. She's not quite 30 yet. And the change in relationship changes too. I mean, the turning point with my middle daughter was when I looked at her when she recalled something that happened in her childhood. And instead of like my mom used to do, oh, that didn't happen. You made that all up, or wouldn't validate. I looked at her and I said, I don't recall it happening, but if it did, I'm sorry. As a parent, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to learn when you become a parent. You're going to make mistakes.
You're going to make mistakes. And those mistakes are going to come like to your face sometimes, and you have to like own them. And I think it's such an important thing for a child to see you own the mistake, even if you don't remember, to be able to own it, because I do think it really makes them feel seen and heard, and that their concerns, their pain is valid and valuable.
So you're going to read part of your book for it?
Yeah, sure. So this one's on authority dynamics, since we're already talking about that.
There you go.
Children should understand their personal power and exercise it where appropriate in certain situations. A child may not be ready for or capable of using their power to determine the best, safest, or more appropriate course of action. This is where your authority as a parent takes precedent. A family's power dynamic should not be upside down, where children are in charge and making determinations about the course and behavior of the family, and parents either ignore or follow the directions from the child. It's important to be okay with your parental authority, neither abusing it to maintain control, that using that control as a method to cover up other skills that may be lacking: conflict management, communication, consistent behavior management. Parenting styles play a crucial role in shaping children's self-esteem and their sense of authenticity. And then, sort of there's a piece around sort of as an adult with imposter syndrome, it's usually quite deferential in terms of authority situations and has difficulty feeling authorized by them. And also internalizing their accomplishments as a method of understanding why they might have authority in a particular situation. In interpersonal dynamics, including those other than work, people with imposter syndrome can find themselves overvaluing the opinions of others and undervaluing those of their own, largely because they are negative and they don't believe them. They harbor an intense need to please others and often lack clarity about their own future.
That is so true. I myself struggle with imposter syndrome, so I can just imagine what an effect this book's going to make on bringing up a generation where they don't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah, that's my dream, is that, because one as a clinician, as a psychologist and a coach, one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, and I get to see it a lot, which is when a client really overcomes it, what's possible in their life just becomes like insane. It becomes more than I could ever even imagine, like, because they're holding themselves back. They're not applying for things that they're qualified for. They're not necessarily asking for promotions. They've been so stuck, and to see them get to blossom is just like the coolest thing ever. And if kids could feel that earlier and earlier on, so that they can actually take advantage of this ever-changing world, I think it would be a really like lovely and powerful and empowering thing to see younger people do that. So
there's another thing that you hit on in the book is to make sure that you instill in them self-care, because a lot of people are very guilty about taking care of themselves and they feel like they're doing something wrong, and children are kind of seeing their parents thinking, oh, I'm not taking time for myself. So the children don't take time for themselves when they become an adult. And that cycle just continues. So how can we instill that it's important for self-care for children?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that, like us having stress, our kids have stress, even though many parents will often say, like, if you think this is stress, you should have grown up in my household, and sort of feel like their stress isn't the same as ours or not as strong as ours. And I think it's really important to validate their own experience of stress and support their stress relief, and it shouldn't be things like what we call pseudo regulators, like, their phones or social media. These are not actual real self-care techniques. These are pseudo regulators. They're regulating while you're using them, and then when you get away from them, they stop regulating, which is why people get so addicted to them. And so really teaching them habits around taking care of their bodies for release of stress and tension, taking care of their minds. Who do they talk to process difficult problems and issues? The reflective self-care. So how do they think about like mindfulness, meditation, feeling still in their bodies, feeling grounded? Building these skills in ourselves first, and then our kids becomes super important because emotional regulation is such a key piece of what goes on with imposter syndrome, because when we're dysregulated, our nervous system's triggered, we go into very primitive places of like fight or flight or flee or fawn. And we don't necessarily take the moment to kind of like really process the feelings that we're having and then think about how to move forward in a way that isn't reactive. And so we want them as growing adults to have skills to not be reactive to the stress that they feel, that they're taking care of them continuously and have a process.
Now, you mentioned with children with their phones. Let's talk about social media, because social media can definitely hit the imposter syndrome hard, because social media is highlight reels most of the time. You don't see a lot of people talk about, oh, I messed this up, I messed that up. I'm trying to be as real as possible on my social media, but sometimes I'm like, this is not the great shot, I'm not going to post it. So let's talk about the role of social media, because kids today have that now more than ever. I mean, when we were growing up, we didn't have that.
Yeah, and I think it pulls for a lot of ideas around pseudo regulation, because I think the kids feel like they're getting something out of it oftentimes that is soothing or comforting, but they're often getting other things out of it that are problematic. So for example, like, seeing people use products and feel like they have to buy the products, which is why all the Sephora things have gone nuts, or like, feeling like, I'm not going to be cool unless I do X, or unless I actually can do Y or Z, whatever it is. And I think the compare and despair quality of social media is really dangerous, because compare and despair is a very foundational piece of imposter syndrome, is feeling like you're looking at somebody else and you're always worse. And social media like easily makes us do that, like look at ourselves and be like, my life isn't anywhere near that. And I think it's really important for kids to be not comparing themselves to people's highlight reels or produced, kind of content, but to really recognize that, they have their own unique life voice that is valuable. And it doesn't matter how many likes you get on it. What matters is, are you happy with it? Are you feeling a sense of connection and joy about your own life? And if they don't know, then we need to kind of work on that and help them to understand what would make you feel a little bit more joyful or connected or enjoying that life, that you have, So I do think sometimes that becomes important for us to figure out, are they running from their lives, to using social media to run from their own lives that they're not happy with? Right?
Now, what percentage of ethnic groups are the imposter syndromes more prevalent in?
To date, there are no significantly different findings in any racial group. And so think people find that hard to believe, because you see a lot of like stuff around like, people of color experience it more, but we don't have any data that suggests that. We do know that for particular groups, there are different features. Like, for example, for Asian people, there are often a correlation between imposter syndrome and feelings of shame. And for Black people, what we find is that there's a connection between imposter syndrome and feeling more depressed after an experience of discrimination. So we do see unique features of that, but in terms of prevalence, we haven't seen consistent results that show any difference. They're just about the same.
Wow, because I would think, especially with the overturning of the DEI policies right now, that you would think there would be more of imposter syndrome, like, oh, you just got your job because of this policy,
Yeah.
When in fact they were probably the most qualified for the job.
Person and the job. Yeah, absolutely. And what we find is that there is like you're saying, the double impact of imposter syndrome for marginalized groups. So women, people of color, anybody who feels on the margin. The double impact is this experience when you experience imposter syndrome internally. I'm not good enough, I don't belong. And then you get these discriminatory biased messages externally that say, oh, you're here because you're a diversity hire, you don't belong here, you're not qualified. And that reinforces imposter syndrome. And what the research finds is that most important factor in dealing with imposter syndrome, when you deal with the double impact, is community. Having community that is similar to you in identity, that is like, if you're dealing with it at work, that's either lateral to you or senior to you, that can help you to take those external messages and push them away. So if you don't internalize those external messages, they won't eat you alive, but you have to actually work with community oftentimes to not internalize those messages.
Yeah, I can see the biggest difference in my oldest daughter. she's getting her PhD right now, but she mastered out of the program that she was in because she's studying environmental toxicology at one of the
Oh, so
colleges
cool.
because her PI above her was just not very for women of color. I mean, she's Mexican American, so women of color or women in general in science. And you would think that a
Yeah.
woman in science would support more women in science. And so she ended up going with a girl that was doing her postdoc in the lab that got a job at another university. And the biggest day and night from that lab to this lab, because her PI, I'm going to shout her out, Dr. Nicole Sparks. I'm going to shout her out. She does things to encourage groups and encourage people, and she has outings with them, and they go dinner, they do birthdays, they do
Yeah,
things that
community.
encourages each other. Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to remember that just because somebody is similar to you in some identity doesn't mean they have the same like approach toward issues of discrimination. Sometimes they've what we call internalize the oppressor. And so they believe that succeeding is in essence becomes a way of pushing out other people similar to them. And so I do think it's like you have to make sure that somebody believes the thoughts and acts upon the thoughts to support others and create community. That you can't possibly do that if internally you feel like, no, you don't deserve it, I deserved it, and you're feeling like this like crabs in a barrel mentality, or this idea that there can only be one of us, or there can only be a couple of us. And I think those kinds of attitudes are so problematic, and they do oftentimes prevent people from finishing things because they get pushed down so deeply, and they often feel like paralyzed in the ability to kind of like, how do I get out of this? Especially in doctoral programs, but in a lot of places where you typically have a mentor and then that's it. You don't really have like 5 mentors. And so in order to leave that mentor, you have to go find somebody else who will take you on, which is not easy.
Yeah. So let's talk about creating community for our children so that because that's important, growing up,
Yeah.
their friends and everything else, to make sure that they don't have that imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, community is so important. And I think not only community, though, because I think oftentimes I hear a lot of conversation about like, oh, kids just need to socialize. Kids do need to socialize, but it's so important that parents are involved in the socialization of their children, because it's important that the socialization is happening to build them up or to develop skills, but not to break them down.
Yeah.
And in a lot of socialization groups, like there's a lot of behavior that gets put up with that is like, they call it like mean girl behavior, or boys just being boys. That's really destructive to self-esteem and to feelings of belonging. So I do think it's really important not to ignore these things when you hear these things are going on with your child, to intervene, start to have conversations with your child about how they can deal with conflict in these particular circumstances. Are these the best people for them? Are there ways to find new friends? Like, just because they're convenient and they're at your school or they're at your activity doesn't mean they have to be your friends. Like, they can just be people you deal with. They don't have to be your friends. So helping them to understand that the curation of friendships is really important, that the friend should really support you, not just be around, and definitely not be around to hurt you. And so I do think teaching conflict resolution skills, these don't develop by accident. So conflict resolution is also a huge thing for imposter syndrome, because we often are people pleasers and don't know how to deal with conflict. We run away from it. Really teaching a kid how to develop really good conflict management skills becomes so important. And really, it's often in our hands as parents, because they're not doing it at school and they're not doing it other places.
So how can we teach those coping skills, those conflict resolution skills?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really understanding like the basis of conflict resolution is like really being able to face the conflict and face the issue at hand. And then being able to help your child feel like they have the communication skills, the ability to kind of like negotiate and recognize they may not get all that they want in a particular circumstance, but how can they deal with sort of a negotiation that doesn't end up they get everything. How can you kind of make sure everyone gets something? Can you address the behavior and expect that, the behavior that you want to change tomorrow? Probably not. But can you hold someone accountable consistently to changing that behavior if they start to backslide? But allowing them to have these kinds of conversations with you about how the conflict is going, how the management of conflict is going. Do they need additional supports wherever they are, whether it's like a coach or a teacher to help them do it? But really helping them to understand that conflict isn't a bad thing in and of itself. It actually, in healthy relationships, conflict grows relationships, but in dysfunctional relationships, it destroys them. And so, like, it's really important to be able to recognize that if a relationship can't withstand conflict and tolerate it, it's likely not a healthy relationship.
So that's another question. How can we tell if a relationship is healthy or not? Because, you have kids, especially teenagers, they don't know what's healthy. They think, oh, this guy's
No.
super cool. He has a nice car. Or, this girl's super cool. She's got she checks all the boxes. But in fact, they're not a very nice person. So how can you?
Yeah. And I think it's really, I think when I think about it for my own kids, part of it is like I do have a very open relationship with them. So they come home and they tell me stories and I listen to the stories and I'm gathering information as a parent. And I'm trying to begin to assess for myself, like whether or not this relationship sounds like it's working or not in their favor. And then oftentimes I will do a lot of inquiry as to kind of like, when she says that, does that feel like it feels good or does it feel bad? How do you deal with it? Like, that sounds a little rough, what is your, so telling them like, sort of, what is your plan? If she says it again, like, what do you want to do? So I'm often having these like imaginal conversations about the next step with what they're dealing with friends. And sometimes, it can get out, and I have teenagers. And so it can get out of control where I have to step in, where it's gone to a place where they can't handle this and I need to get in there. And so I am making determinations what is appropriate for their age to handle and what do I need to get involved in. And so, I do feel like sometimes I have to get involved because there's something that they cannot handle and that I need to handle it as a parent and model handling it as a parent, because that's also too, I'm not going to avoid the conflict because it's more comfortable for me. I need them to see I'm not afraid of conflict either. And so like helping them to kind of deal with the skills that they can deal with. And then when I need to stepping in.
Yeah, because that brings me to another question. When do they step in but don't overstep? Because a lot of parents, when they step in, they overstep and they go way beyond, or they come in fighting mode instead of resolution mode. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what I'm. Yeah, and I think you have to, especially as a parent, I'm not dealing with the kid. I'm dealing with the other parent. And so I think I've seen it even with my own kids, like parents try to confront children and they shouldn't be doing that.
Mm-hmm.
That is not your purview to confront a child about the behavior. Your purview is to talk to the adult. And I think it's a conversation with the adult. Here's what my kid is saying and is going on. I'm concerned about it. What are you hearing from your kid? And then they have to go back usually and ask the kid what happened. A lot of times in my experience, what comes back is a denial. Like my kid said that didn't happen. And so in a lot of ways, we have to do some work around sort of like, okay, so where are we going to move from here? My kid is saying this happened and your kid is saying it's not happened. In some of the cases I've been a part of, there have been witnesses. And so sometimes I have to bring in the parent of the witness to kind of be like, okay, this is happening. And then we have to work to figure out how our kids are going to get along better. And I don't want to be right here. What I want us to come to is some better way of handling the situation that our kids can both learn from. And look, this is not easy. I have myself had very difficult conversations with parents that have been incredibly messy and incredibly difficult. But I'm also not going to quit until we get to some better place. I'm not going to leave it like, okay, it just is what it is. No, it's not going to stay. It is what it is. Like we're going to come to some resolution, or we're going to find somebody who can. Whether it's I've got to now bring in like a coach or somebody else to kind of help us to come to some other conclusion. But like, I don't want to leave. If my kid is experiencing something that they're either afraid of or is concerning, I'm not going to leave it where it is. And I think, about it in a way that I'm not only helping my child, but I'm helping this other child. This other child is struggling with something that, yes, may have hurt my kid, but I don't believe kids are inherently bad, and I do think that kid is struggling. So I want that kid to also get what they need to not keep doing this, not only to my own kid, but to other kids. And so what I'm trying to do is intervene in a way that kid can get what they need too. And so I'm also often approaching it from that lens, is like, I want this parent to hear me so that they can also do what they need to do with their kid, that kid gets to know what they need to.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wish people would understand more, is when you sit down and have conversations, instead of pointing fingers, finding fault with people, or doing that, or your child did this. Where did they learn this from? They could have learned it from anywhere. It doesn't matter where. It doesn't matter if it's the parent. It doesn't matter. They could have seen it on
social media.
Media, on the radio, in a song, whatever. They could have learned it from anywhere. But instead of pointing fingers, sitting down and finding the solution and working together.
Yeah, because also ongoing, it makes it better, right? Like nobody solves a situation in one conversation. Usually it takes a variety, and people don't change behavior like this. And so you're
Mhm.
going to need to have ongoing conversations with them. And the more they feel like you're not necessarily on their side, but you're not trying to hurt their kid. We just want to come to some understanding of like, how do we do this a little better? What just happened was like not okay. Like, how do we do this better? All kids make mistakes. All kids are growing. All kids are learning.
Mhm.
How do we help them learn in this moment? And so, and I also too, like, I think, in terms of my experience with my own kids, sometimes they have wanted to do something for themselves. Like, so they've had a negative interaction with somebody. It's gone negative a lot of times, and they don't want to keep interacting with them. Would
Mhm.
I encourage them probably to try to keep interacting with them? Yes, and I do. But if their decision is, I don't want any more part of this, I honor that and I respect that. Like, if you don't want a part of this, you don't have to.
So how do we as parents pull back the reins a little bit to allow the kids to make that decision for themselves? Because so many times parents are so super involved in their kids' lives. I mean, I've seen it with my youngest, some of her friends, their parents were so involved. They were even helping them with the schoolwork when they were in high school. And I'm like, they're in high school. How are they going to find in the real world
Manage college.
if you're helping them with their schoolwork in high school? I mean, come on, pull back the reins some and let our child become
I
the
think we
person.
always got to think about like, yeah, like what is what is their next developmental learning process, right? So for me with I think about my teenager, and for her right now, like what she I think needs to work on is boundary setting. She needs to feel like she can say, no, I'm not going to tolerate this. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Like, and so for her, we're working on that. My little one, we're working on actually talking about conflict. So she just wants to be mad at people and not have conversations. And so we're working on actually having the conversation and actually trying to say the thing. And so like they're very different places. So and being conscious about where your kid is at is really important. And every kid is developmentally, even if they're supposed to be at a certain age by, place by 15 to 16,
Mhm.
whatever. Every kid is different. Every kid is dealing with something different. So it's about knowing your kid and knowing what the next they call it in like Piaget and development, like what's the next scaffolded step is like, what do we have to teach them next? And I'm often thinking about that, like with them. And it does help to take a step back from it when you're thinking about that and not to necessarily just like go with the instinct is like, okay, like what does my kid need to learn here that they're struggling with that would build a set of skills? And for every child, it's likely going to be a little different.
Yeah, and you hit a point. Each child is different. You can raise. I have 3 girls, and each one of my girls are totally different, and they're
Yeah.
raised in the same household, but they all
Yeah.
have different personalities, and so what may work with one child will not work
Yeah.
with the other child. So as parents, we're constantly on our toes trying to learn how to interact with each child the way they respond to the most.
Yeah, completely. And I think, you point to another good point that does arise in imposter syndrome, which is the good kid, the bad kid, all of these kinds of notions that are very, very rigid about how kids form identity. And I think it's so important to make sure like every kid is the kid, like there's not a good kid, a bad kid. There's just kids. Some kids require more attention, more work. Some kids require less, but that doesn't mean one is good and one is bad. It's just that they're just different people. And so, like, I think really that's such an important, even if you don't say it to the kid, but you think it, the kids know you think it because the way you respond to them, the way you interact with them shows it. And so I do think it's helpful to push out these notions of these black and white ideas of like one kid is easy, one kid's hard. They're all going to be hard at some point in different ways, and they're all going to be easy. But your job is to kind of really meet them where they're at and try to help them get to the next place. And so really being okay. And also for self-care for parents, when you are more exhausted by, one child may be more exhausting, that's true, but take care of yourself. That's what you got to do.
Mhm.
The kid is probably not going to be any different. You need to be different. You need to be taking care of yourself so you have enough of a reservoir to reach into. Otherwise, it does become more painful to deal with a kid that requires more at this moment.
Now, you mentioned, what a good kid, bad kid, it doesn't matter. All kids are different. But what happens when they're in school and they have the same teacher and they try to compare them to each other and the imposter syndrome happens there too? I mean, I'm speaking from experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, teacher, coaches, all kinds of people can do that compare and despair stuff. And so I do think it's good to have a conversation, parent teacher conference or in some other way, be like, I know that you've had my previous child and you had a nice experience with them. This one's been different. I need you to see them as different and not necessarily as duplicates of each other, and not to compare them in that way. It really does send negative messages to them about like who they are in this moment. And so if you need help managing them, let me know. I'm more than happy to kind of get involved and be a part of this, but please don't compare them to their sibling. It really is not only detrimental to them, but detrimental to their relationship with their sibling. And so I sometimes you just gotta, teachers don't know everything. Teachers, like parents, they're not necessarily schooled in every single thing they need to be schooled in. So it sometimes is helpful to intervene on your child's behalf and let them know, like, I prefer if you don't compare them. It's not helpful to them. And I know it's easy to do that, but to really resist it.
That brings me to the next question. How do we resist the siblings from seeing each other as imposters? Like my youngest, I love her to death, but she has her own little path in her life, and I'm like, she has to find out what makes her happy. I mean, she's 22, she's still young adult. She has to find out. But the other two are like, no, you need to do this, you need to do this. I'm like, no, she's doing what she needs to do right now. Quit telling her how to live her life.
Exactly.
They play off each other and make her feel bad because she's living her life the way it's supposed to be lived.
Yes.
Comfortable.
And I think it's really important for siblings to remember their role. You are a sister, you are not a parent here, and allow me to parent. And so really that we talked about the asserting of authority in those places, even though they're adult children, to be like, I'm doing the parenting here, you're not doing the parenting, you do the sistering. If you, build a relationship with her as a sister, not a parent. I know you're concerned for her, but I'm not as her parent, and I will be the one managing this. And so sometimes people need a role reminder, like you are not parent, you are not semi-parent, you are a sibling. And to be connected to your sibling in that way. And if you're struggling, go talk to someone about it. Because oftentimes what you see happening with the younger sibling is they may be getting an opportunity to explore things the older siblings felt like they had no right to or whatever. And then go explore that, go process that. That's part of being an adult. Is kind of figuring out sort of what you need in your own life. Maybe there's something pulling upon you that you didn't get to explore or enjoy. And I think you need to deal with that. And so really helping them to figure out, like, how do they process whatever's going on for what it means to them, and to develop a sibling relationship with their sibling, not a parental, because that makes for conflict.
Big time conflict.
Yeah. When they think that they're parents, but they're really an older sibling, and it pisses the younger one off. The older ones get pissed off for the person not listening. And it does sometimes takes maturity to recognize everyone's on their own path, and not every path is the same, but every path needs to be respected.
Yeah, that's true. And that is so true with any child or any parent. You can't compare your parenting style to someone else's parenting style. And I think that's where a lot of people get in trouble, is they don't parent like I do, so you can't go spend time. And your child's like, why? And then they feel like they're the imposter because their friends are all doing this and they're not allowed to do it. And, you need to have conversations with your kids.
Yeah, and there might be certain like parental things that are going on with other people's household that you definitely don't want. Like they're either too permissive or they're letting things go wild. Yeah, but it just because someone does parent differently doesn't necessarily mean they're a danger. There's some kinds that they are a danger. But I think it's important to differentiate between what's a danger and difference in parenting styles. What's just a difference? Your kid is not going to be raised by those people. They're just going to go to their house or have dinner at their place, but they're not going to be raised by them. And I think having those conversations when they come home and they were like, Sally's mom does X. And I'm like, great for Sally. This is not what we do in our own household. We do something different. And this is why we do the different thing. So I do think, they're going to come back with other thoughts about how you should be parenting sometimes. And to remind them, like, this is why we parent the way we do. This is our particular approach. Everyone has their own approach.
Yeah, instead of saying because I said so. Because I think that was the main thing when I was growing up. You do it because I said so. When you questioned whatever, it's because I told you to do it. Do it. Or you can't go there because I said no. No reasoning, no rhyme behind it. Just no.
Yeah. And it is back to that's like an authoritarian style of parenting where a kid has no choice or a kid has no say. And so really remembering that you want to bring a more of an authoritative viewpoint, like, so explaining the reason why you do certain things doesn't mean you have to change it. Just means you're just like telling them, this is my philosophy on parenting. And so if they were like, well, why? And then you're like, this is what I've developed over my lifetime of experience. And maybe you'll be a different parent, but this is the way I'm parenting.
It's like when I told my daughter, I was like, as parents, when you become a parent, you'll know you'll make mistakes. You're not perfect, but you got to own up to the mistakes and say, hey, my bad, and go on and move on.
Yeah. Yeah. Learn from them if you can. And then also to recognize your children's children potentially will be parented completely different too. And to really be able to recognize nobody's got the answer. I don't know if there is the answer. There are answers. There are interesting, kind of findings, but they're not like, there's not the answer.
Yeah, for sure. And you also expose them to experiences that you may not necessarily want them to experience, but like, for instance, like when my mom passed away, my girls came with us to the funeral home to go through everything. So they know as an adult what they're going to do, how they're going to do, how to plan a funeral, how to, life skills like that are very important.
Yeah. And you were saying earlier about sometimes parents protect their kids from certain experiences that then make them unable to handle them. So I do think it is sometimes right developmentally to expose your kids to things that are difficult, hard, even painful for you. But they need to recognize not everything is easy peasy. Not everything is just like, pleasant, joyful, easy. That there are a lot of things that are hard and yet you still keep going.
And that you don't just snap your fingers and somebody else does it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So they have to also see the hard work behind it.
Yep. So, Dr. Lisa, our time is almost up. Before we get to talk about where people can find you and where they can find a book, is there any last little nugget that you want to share that either we talked about that you want to reshare to make sure you got your point home, or something we didn't talk about that you want to share?
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I'm hearing a lot, which is I think really interesting, and I didn't sort of expect that when I read the book, which is that people are finding the book helpful for themselves and reparenting the inner child. And so it's not only, I guess, for people with children, but also sometimes for yourself, that when you didn't get certain things and thinking about what you need now as an adult. So that's been a really revelatory experience for me, is like thinking about this book also for adults and thinking about what they didn't get. So, and try to give it to yourself.
And also, too, even if your children are grown, you can still go back and look and say, oh my gosh, I could have changed this. You could have flipped the script on how you did things as a parent so that you're learning from this book as well.
And I think, like you said, like still 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, they're still involved in their development. And so there's always a moment to change and shift. So I don't think it's ever too late either.
So where can people find the book?
So the book is on all major booksellers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, like Books A Million, all the typical big places. And you can also find me on Instagram at Dr. Orbe Austin. And our website's Dynamic Transitions LLP.
I also want to ask you, do you have any other books coming out about imposter syndrome?
I don't have any new ones coming out, but I have two old ones, which are, one is a bestseller and like does really well, which is Own Your Greatness, which is about it's a workbook about how to overcome imposter syndrome. It's about the research-backed interventions that really change imposter syndrome pretty quickly. So if you struggle with it yourself, that's the book you want to get. And then the second book is really about dealing with it as a leader, or organizational culture. So if you run you have a team, that second book, Your Unstoppable Greatness, is really important for that.
I also think, I'm just throwing this out there, that I think it would be great if you wrote a children's book about imposter syndrome, so that
That's a great idea.
So kids can actually pick it up and look at it, and you could pair it with a bundle with this book and say, here, parents, you read this one, kids, you read this one.
I love that. That's a great idea. Such a good idea.
Because
I love
kids
that idea.
don't know what imposter syndromes are, but they know how they're feeling. They don't know the name of the syndrome, but they know that they don't feel as good as their friend does because they feel like their friend has more than they do.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful idea. I love that idea. Maybe I'll pitch that to my editor.
And just say, bundle it together. And
Bundle
so the
it
parents
together.
can be reading this book and the kids can be reading this book.
I love it so much.
Well, Dr. Lisa, thank you for coming on and for sharing this book and for talking about imposter syndrome. This was such a fun interview.
I had a blast too. It was great. Thank you so much for having me.
So, guys, I will put in the show notes everywhere you can find Dr. Lisa, as well as find her books, not just this book, Your Child's Greatness, but the other two I'm going to link as well, because I actually think I'm going to go buy Own Your Greatness, because I think I need that book too.
I love it. We all need it. I needed it myself. I wrote it.
Of course, you wrote it, so you needed it.
It's because I needed it. Yes.
So until next time, guys, fight that imposter syndrome. Bye.